Our lecture for this week is going to focus on the cosmological argument for God's existence. So this is the second argument that we're going to be considering this semester for God's existence. And this type of argument is very different than the type of argument we looked at last week. So last week we looked at the ontological argument. This week it's the cosmological argument. And I want to take just a few moments to explain how these two arguments are different from each other. And to explain the difference, I think it's helpful to get some key terms and concepts down. So when we're talking about arguments in general, there are two different types of arguments that you could provide for any position that you might hold. One type of argument is what's called an a posteriori argument. These types of arguments are arguments that are based upon the experience of the world. So you might say that they're post-experience. And so when you have these types of arguments, the way that you present your case is you might develop different lines of evidence that points to a particular conclusion. And if you do that, you are developing what's called an a posteriori argument. Now that can be contrasted with what's called an a priori argument. And these arguments are arguments based upon reasons that are independent of experience. So you might say that they're prior to experience. Now last week, when we considered the ontological argument, that type of argument is an a priori argument. And for this week, when we're looking at the cosmological argument, this type of argument is an a posteriori argument. Now, when it comes to arguments for God's existence, there are actually two famous arguments that are a posteriori arguments for the existence of God, the cosmological argument and the teleological argument. Cosmological arguments all have this general theme. They argue from the existence of the cosmos to the existence of a first cause or a sufficient reason that explains the cosmos. So all of them have this basic assumption that the universe exists. So we all live in a universe. What is the best explanation for why the universe exists? If you argue or want to argue that God is the best explanation for the universe, then you're developing a cosmological argument of sorts. Now, an argument that we're going to be looking at next week is another a posteriori argument, and that's called the teleological argument for God's existence. And this type of argument infers the existence of a conscious designer for objects within the universe that display an appearance of design. And now this could include the universe as a whole. So maybe the universe as a whole has features that seem to have been designed for a purpose. And if those features are there, then if you're using a teleological argument, you're going to infer that there was a conscious designer for why those features are that way. But these types of arguments can also look at specific things within the universe, such as the human eye. Is there anything about the human eye that bears the marks of design? Or is there anything else in biology or any other of the sciences that bear the marks of design? If there are, then some might argue that the best way to explain those is that there must be a conscious designer for those particular arguments. And when you argue that way, you're developing a teleological argument. But for this week, we will focus primarily on cosmological arguments. Now, one of the things I should say that I've already hinted at is that there is not one version of the cosmological argument. There are actually many different versions of it. So a cosmological argument is really a class of arguments that begins with the assumption that the universe exists and that something outside the universe is required to explain its existence. And all versions of the cosmological argument maintain that the universe is a contingent reality. So we've talked about these distinctions already. These distinctions come up most notably in the ontological argument. But the universe must be a contingent reality, given the cosmological argument, rather than a necessary reality. And we'll see how that distinction comes up in the various versions of this argument. So we'll look at start with just one famous articulation of this argument that was developed by the philosopher Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas argued that there exist things that are caused. So his argument is very much building off of earlier works that go all the way back to the philosopher Aristotle that was trying to develop a theory of causation. And Aquinas buys into a lot of Aristotle's theories of causation, which we won't have a whole lot of time to get into here. But one of the things I'll just point out for now is that when you're trying to understand Aquinas' version of the cosmological argument or the first cause argument, you have to think about why are things in motion? What is causing things to be in motion? And so if it is the case that there are things that are caused, so there are things that exist right now that are here, were caused to be here. And if you move on to the second point in Aquinas' argument, he states that nothing can be the cause of itself. So for everything that exists right now, so as I'm giving this lecture on the computer, my computer is sitting on top of a table. Now this table is didn't just pop into existence, it was caused to be here. The table was manufactured, it was brought to my house, it was brought to my room. There are all these different things that cause this table to be here, and the table is not a cause in itself. So we, again, take the first two statements. There exist things that are cause. 2, nothing can be the cause of itself. 3, there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. And when we look at a different version of the cosmological argument, we might consider why Aquinas thinks this here in a moment. But for now, let's just grant that premise. So there can't be an infinite regress of causes. 4, that follows then that there exists an uncaused first cause. So now this is getting to the distinction between contingency and necessity. So if nothing can be the cause of itself, well, then that is, really talking about a contingent thing. So if something is contingent and it exists contingently, then there's a prior cause that explains why that thing exists. But if there can't be an infinite regress of causes, then what follows is there must be an uncaused first cause, according to Aquinas, and that is a necessary being. So an uncaused first cause for Aquinas is a necessary reality. Well, 5, the word God means uncaused first cause. Therefore, according to Aquinas, God exists. So this is one of the early versions of the cosmological argument that has had a lot of influence throughout Western philosophy, specific religious philosophy. But there are other versions too that we should consider. So for example, Leibniz's argument from contingency. So to understand this argument, you just have to take his famous question, why is there something rather than nothing? And he develops what's called a principle of sufficient reason, which simply states that nothing happens without a sufficient reason. So if there is an object that we are trying to explain, then there must be a reason for why that object exists. So this is true when we're considering small objects. So if you see that globe on your screen that's sitting on the ground, and if you ask, how did that get there? Well, if that needs an explanation for why it exists, then what Leibniz wants us to consider is why would it be any different if we're considering a larger object like a whole universe? The whole universe itself is a large object. And so if a universe exists, then what is the reason for why it exists? There must be some reason if we have an object. Now, what makes Leibniz's version of the argument unique and different from Aquinas' argument is Leibniz is even open to the idea that the universe might be eternal. So on the Aquinas version of the argument, you could conceive of it having cause and effect going back to a temporal beginning. And so there must be an uncaused first cause to the universe, and you can think about that in terms of time. Well, on Leibniz's version of the argument, you might say, even if the universe is eternal, so there's no beginning to the universe, there's no end to the universe, Leibniz says you still have a universe there that needs an explanation. So just because it's eternal doesn't mean that there isn't a sufficient reason for why it exists. So why does this eternal universe exist? It exists sort of as an eternal object out there. And in his argument for contingency, he argues that there must be a necessary cause. Now, don't think temporal cause. Think of sort of a logical cause for the universe to exist if the universe is contingent. Now, why would somebody think that the universe is contingent? Well, even if it's eternal, you could say that the universe doesn't have to exist. And if the universe doesn't have to exist, logically speaking, then it's contingent. But you can work back and ask, well, what is the necessary cause of this contingent universe? Now, if you want to see an argument like that listed out in a syllogism, we can consider Samuel Clarke's version of this argument, where he writes, every being that exists is either contingent or necessary. So again, that distinction becomes important. Not every being can be contingent. 3, therefore, there exists a necessary being upon which the contingent beings depend. 4, a necessary being on which all contingent beings exist is what we mean by God. Therefore, God exists. So there are different versions of this argument from contingency, but this is one argument that falls under the category of a cosmological argument. Now, the one that I want to give a little more time to for this lecture is what's called the Kalām Cosmological Argument. And this is actually what your readings for this week focus on more. Now, the Kalām Argument traces its roots all the way back to the Islamic philosopher and theologian Al-Ghazali. And he developed an argument that goes like this. Every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning. This particular version of the cosmological argument has recently been updated by the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig, who has actually brought in different disciplines to support this particular version of the cosmological argument. So he takes a cross-disciplinary approach using lines of evidence from cosmology, physics, metaphysics, and theology to support this argument. And here is how Craig develops the argument. Premise 1, Craig writes, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, the universe has a cause of its existence. So we might work through each step of this argument. So if we're thinking about premise 1 of the argument, whatever begins to exist has a cause. One of the common questions that somebody might bring up is, well, what caused God? Well, according to this argument, and really according to all cosmological arguments, when we're talking about God, we're not talking about a being that begins to exist. So when you look at premise 1 is whatever begins to exist has a cause. What caused God? Well, God doesn't begin to exist. Because on the definition of God, and actually you can see the influence of the ontological argument here, on the concept of God that we're dealing with, God is a necessary reality, not a contingent reality. So in a sense, when we're looking at this first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause, really what we're saying is whatever is contingent, or whatever is a contingent reality must have a cause. A necessary reality, on the other hand, does not need a cause. So this is where the distinction between necessity and contingency really becomes important. So if you accept premise 1 that every contingent thing has a cause, then you can move to premise 2. Now premise 2 is that the universe began to exist. So are there reasons for accepting premise 2? Well, Craig gives two different lines of evidence for this premise. He starts out with a philosophical argument for it, using an illustration from the mathematician David Hilbert. It's called Hilbert's Hotel. So to understand this particular illustration, so this is a philosophical argument for why there can't be an infinite regress of time. So on Hilbert's Hotel, you have to imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. And if you have an infinite number of rooms, and then you have a bus that drives up to the hotel, and the bus is an infinite bus with an infinite number of passengers. Now, if you have this bus come up to Hilbert's Hotel with an infinite number of rooms, the question is, can you fit all of the guests, an infinite number of guests, into an infinite number of rooms? And the answer is yes. And so you fill up the hotel with an infinite number of guests. And once you do that, there are no vacancies anymore in the hotel because the hotel is occupied by an infinite number of guests in the infinite number of rooms. But now, as you consider this thought experiment, imagine that you have another bus that comes up with an infinite number of passengers, and they want to stay in Hilbert's Hotel. Well, can the hotel accommodate them? Well, according to the concept of infinity, the hotel can accommodate them, and all they need to do is they need to move everyone who is in the odd rooms into the even rooms. And if you move everyone into double the room that they're in, you've just freed up an infinite number of rooms so that the hotel can accommodate an infinite number of guests. And so you have this weird thing where a hotel that had no vacancies now is able to keep all of the people who are already in the hotel, and at the same time, they're able to accommodate an infinite number of new guests. Or you can think about it in the reverse. So imagine you have an infinite number of guests in this infinite hotel, and you have an infinite number of guests leave. Well, how many people are left in the hotel? Well, what's interesting about Hilbert's Hotel is if you have an infinite number of guests in an infinite number of rooms, and an infinite number of those guests leave, you actually have every number from 0 to infinity. So you could have an infinite number of guests leave, and you're essentially what you're doing is you're taking infinity minus infinity, and you could have 0. So there'd be 0 guests left. But you could also have 3. And the way that you would imagine this is if you have an infinite number of guests in an infinite number of rooms, and every guest starting in room 4 and later leaves, well, you have a situation where an infinite number of guests leave, and you started with infinity, you subtracted infinity, and the answer that you have come up with is that there's still 3 guests left. Guests in room number 1, 2, and 3. Well, now, how does any of this produce an argument for the idea that the universe must have begun to exist? Well, Craig's argument is that Hilbert's Hotel illustrates the impossibility of there being an actual infinite number of things. In other words, infinity is a concept that exists in the mind. It's a mathematical concept, but that concept cannot be brought into a physical reality. In other words, there can't be an infinite number of moments that have existed before this moment, because if you say that there are, some absurd conclusions would result. And so if we want to state out the argument this way, we would start with premise 1. An actual infinite number of events cannot exist. And the reason why it can't exist is because a beginningless series of events in time entails that there's an actual infinite number of things. So imagine for a moment that there have been an infinite number of moments before this moment. Well, if you're starting at the beginning, back into infinity, then how is it that we ever could arrive at this moment today? If there's been a beginningless series of events in time, it entails that there's been an actual number of things that have occurred before this moment. And the conclusion that you would draw from this is that a beginningless series of events in time cannot exist. So this is a philosophical argument that Craig presents to say that the universe must be finite and not infinite. But then, in addition to this philosophical argument, he does bring in some arguments from physics, cosmology, to show that based upon recent developments in Big Bang cosmology, we now have reason to think that the universe did in fact have a beginning. And the way that you think about the beginning of the universe is to think about what the properties of the universe all entail. So if the universe consists of time, space, mass, energy, and you maybe could add some other properties in there, well, what do we know? What is cosmology telling us about the universe? Well, one of the things that we get from, one of the informations that we gain from Big Bang cosmology is that the universe is expanding. So one of the ways to understand the expansion of the universe is to imagine for a moment that the universe is a balloon. So if you get a balloon and you start drawing galaxies and stars and whatever on this balloon, and then you start blowing up the balloon, that's what, when cosmologists say that the universe is expanding, that's sort of what they mean. And so in other words, they're not saying that galaxies are moving further away from each other. They're saying actually space itself, which is one of the properties of the universe. So you can think of that as the space between galaxies. Space itself is expanding. Mass is expanding. Matter is expanding. Time is expanding. And so what that means is if you look at where we're at in the universe right now, we exist at T 13.7 billion years. So that's our current moment. But if you rewind the clock, what that means is that the universe going backwards would be shrinking. So 5 billion years after the beginning of the universe is smaller than what it is today. 1 billion, it's smaller yet. And you go all the way back to the singularity. Now, the singularity is the point, it's at T0, where literally the distance between one side of the galaxy to the other side of the galaxy would be 0. Now, if you ask the question, what is it that brought time, space, mass, and energy into existence? Well, according to Craig, he argues that the cause of the universe must be timeless. And the reason is time can't cause itself. I mean, time is one of the properties of the universe that begins to exist. So something that would create time must be outside of time, and so it's timeless. Space also begins to exist, and therefore the cause of space must be spaceless. Matter, mass, begins to exist, so it must be immaterial. It must be outside of matter. It must also have potential. So whatever the cause is, it has to have the potential of bringing a universe into existence. Otherwise, the universe wouldn't exist. If there's no potential, there's no universe. But now you have some questions. What is the nature of this timeless, spaceless, immaterial, potential first cause? Well, if you say that it's conscious, so if there's a conscious first cause that's timeless, spaceless, immaterial, well, that sounds a lot like God. So that would be what it means to say that God was the cause of the universe. If you say that the cause is not conscious, then we're not talking about God anymore. We're not talking about a mind that brings the universe into existence. It's some other type of cause. You could ask, is it the laws of physics? Well, now when you conceive of the laws this way, you can't think of the laws as being actually physical things because physical things exist inside the universe, so they're a property of the universe. So if you conceive of the law of physics as being sort of in a Platonic law, like conceptual law of physics that governs the universe, maybe those exist outside of the cosmos, maybe they're more fundamental than the cosmos, then maybe that provides an explanation, or maybe some sort of law of mathematics or something like that explains how the universe began to exist. Whatever it is, whatever the nature of that cause, Craig wants to argue that it's timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and it has potential. And so if we go back to the argument, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe, that is time, space, matter, energy, all of the properties of the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. Well, now we ask the question, what are the likely candidates for being the first cause of the universe? On your screen, I'm listing 3 different types of explanations. So you might say that nothing brought the universe into existence. In fact, there's a cosmologist, Lawrence Krauss, who argues that the universe came into being from nothing. He has a book called The Universe from Nothing. One of the things that Craig wants us to think about is he wants us to really hone in on what is meant by the term nothing. And the word nothing, according to Craig, is no thing. It's not anything. So if you go back to the attributes that have to be the type of thing that bring the universe into existence, so it has to be timeless, spaceless, massless, but then it has to have potential. Well, if a thing has potential, then it's not nothing, according to Craig. And so you would have to give your reasons for saying that nothing is not the best explanation. But if you want to put a different label on it, maybe we have some idea that's consistent with Plato, that there's maybe a realm of the forms that is more basic than the universe, a conceptual world, but it's not God. Then you have to develop what exactly that means to say that that brought the universe into existence. If you say that it's God, then you say it's timeless, massless, spaceless, and it has potential, and it's a conscious being, and that's option number 2. Or somebody might say that we exist in a multiverse where we're actually a daughter universe to a parent universe, and maybe we live in an infinite ensemble of universes, and our universe was actually brought about by a prior universe. So these are the 3 different types of causes that could explain the existence of the universe. And so if we trace out this particular argument, we start at the top with the universe. So the universe is the thing that needs to be explained. Why is it that we have a universe? Well, either that universe was caused or the universe is uncaused. Well, to develop a cosmological argument, you have to present reasons to show why it's incoherent to say that the universe was uncaused, or why it's not reasonable even to believe that the universe was uncaused. And then you move out to the next step of the argument, and you say, okay, so if the universe was cause, what is the nature of the cause? Either the universe is self-caused, or there is a transcendent cause to the universe. Now, one of the reasons why you would say that the universe is not self-caused is because for a thing to exist, or for a thing to cause something to exist, it has to exist. But if you're causing yourself to exist, you have to exist before you're able to cause yourself, and then you come into a contradiction. Now, the way that this applies to the Kalām argument is, again, if space is the thing that needs to be explained, well, space can't be the cause for space. So it has to be something that's outside of space that is the explanation for why space exists. So this is where you get the idea that it must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, because to say that the first cause is material, physical, well, then you're arguing for some notion of the universe cause itself, which is an incoherent idea. So then you move to the next option, that it's a transcendent cause. Well, the word transcendent only means that the cause of the universe is outside of the thing being explained. So to say that there's a cause that transcends the universe is just saying if the universe is the thing that needs the explanation, the thing that explains it is outside the universe itself. So that's what transcendent means. And this is where you get into the nature of the transcendent cause. Either the transcendent cause is personal, and in that case you're talking about something sort of like God, or that transcendent cause is impersonal, And in that case, you're talking about something like nothing brought the universe into existence, some Platonic forms brought the universe into existence, or we live in a multiverse, something like that. And what's important to note at this point in the argument is that the difference here between theism and atheism, and we talked about this a few lectures ago, it turns out that the difference is the difference between a personal transcendent cause to the universe versus an impersonal transcendent cause to the universe. If you think that there's an impersonal transcendent cause to the universe, you would be classified as an atheist. If you think that there's a personal transcendent cause, then you'd be classified as a theist. Well, for our next lecture then, what we're going to be discussing is whether or not there are any reasons to prefer a personal first cause over an impersonal first cause. And that's really what the teleological argument focuses on. And so that's where we'll turn to next time.